So, welcome to the talk on diversity in Infosec. My name is Victoria Walberg. A lot of people probably know me as Vicky Joe online. I also run my own consultancy, which is Logically. So today's talk is going to be a talk in two parts. For part one, I'll use the OSI 7-layer model as a talking point for the diverse areas of work and research and areas of concern across the Infosec spectrum. Part two is Rockstars versus Plumbers, and I'll talk about the work that enterprise security people do across the layers and how this relates to Rockstar researchers and security versus compliance. So with both parts, I want to provide a broad overview for people new to or thinking about entering the industry, and also to those who have been more focused in specific areas of work or research. So, part one. So I go to various cons and meetups. Some can be quite siloed, so they're the more techie ones like BSides or Insomniac, and they tend to focus on things like malware and pen testing or research, and things like the OWASP meetups, software development lifecycle, DevSecOps, and then I go to the IC squared meetups as well, and they're more regulation, policy, and enterprise, and it can feel quite tribal at times. So for those not familiar with the OSI model, it's up there on the screen. Across on the right-hand side, you've also got the TCP IP model. So certain things don't fit in as neatly into the OSI layer model. It would like when we talk about those. So I am going to play with terminology. It's not going to be strict at all, and I'm going to broaden the scope. So I'm going to be taking a few liberties. So my background is network engineer, sysadmin, long time ago. I've done a lot of roles where I've had to do a bit of everything. And in some ways, things have changed. There's been an evolution of tech in general, and today roles are a lot more focused. So there's a larger variety of roles and technologies, and there are a lot of things that exist now that didn't when I started, and lots of things that have gone away, more recently Solaris. But when I'm working as a security manager or a consultant, I have to think about all these layers and beyond. So the last time I gave this presentation, I did switch things around a bit, and I started with the data layer because I think that's the key thing that people are trying to protect is data. But I will go back and start with physical this time. So in terms of things like threats, you've got things like in the enterprise, you've got theft and loss and fire and flood and the disaster recovery types of things that a lot of governance, risk compliance people think about. And in terms of other physical attacks, you've got people trying to have unauthorized access to physical locations or to data, and perhaps using physical means like USB drives. In the research nation-state space, you've got things like tapping. There's been a lot of controversy lately about the tapping of the undersea cables, and new attacks like Rowhammer involving bit flipping and using the capacitors for doing that. Over on the data side of things, so data in the enterprise are the crown jewels. They're always seen as that. So you've got intellectual property, you've got trade secrets, you've got HR data, you've got finance and payment processing, you've got all that sales and marketing data, things that help support the business. And now with social networks, you've also got a lot of personal data being collected, and that's now being used, and also government networks having a lot of data about people. And that personal data can be used for manipulation of the person. That might be things like for voting, as we've heard recently, and for things like blackmail or extortion. So that's one of the reasons that people are looking for data, is this manipulation of people, but also, aside from the day-to-day running of the business that a business needs data for and making money, you've got criminals who are wanting to also make money. So you've got this issue with politics, corporate espionage, and a lot of it all boils down to financial data, things like blackmail for political gain. And we've got to think about how we defend that data. So a lot of that comes from governance, things like GDPR, which is coming in to help regulate the data, things like the ISO 27001 series, and that's not just ISMS and the 27001, which a lot of people have heard about, but there's a lot of other standards within that series, right down to even ISO 27039 selection, deployment, and operations of intrusion detection systems. They can be quite specific on the technology with those types of standards. And there's also other regulatory controls around data and data processing in certain industries, such as finance. And so a lot of the work that people do in Infosec are providing support and technical controls to support business or regulatory aims. So in terms of threats for that data, you've got data leakage, and we've heard a lot of instances of data breaches. More recently, potentially the one with TSB allegedly, and it might be for a variety of technical and non-technical reasons. That might be failure for access controls, for one. But the loss of that data can have bad knock-on consequences, not just to the business, but also to individuals with things like identity theft, and there's the financial impacts and losses for businesses. And even in the public sector, there's the fines that can be imposed on those public sector institutions. But in a true OSI sense, for data, you've got attacks that include MAC address and ARP spoofing, with a potential loss for confidentiality or integrity, and it could lead to session hijacking. You've got things like IP pool and DHCP starvation, affecting availability, spanning tree, VLAN hopping. So there are things at the data layer technically as well. So in terms of protecting data, I think for defence of it, you've got to look at defence in depth and take more than one control or design to help defend that data. So it's not just things at the data layer that you can do to protect that data, but it's across all the layers, particularly the application layer. So network layer, yeah, I did put up the PPU map. So in terms of threats, in the OSI sense, you've got things like ping of death and routing and packet sniffing and IP spoofing. And that's often indicators of people trying to get a foothold or gather data to be used elsewhere. In terms of defences at the network level, you've got things like firewalls and access controls, and authentication, and encryption might mitigate some of the attacks, such as packet sniffing. So those are sorts of things that a lot of network engineers, or security network engineers as they tend to go by now, help prevent. At the transport layer, so with TCP traffic, and this is where you've got a bit of a difference between the OSI and the TCP layer, connections are established at the transport layer. So in terms of injections, that's where you've got your man-in-the-middle attacks, so things like a mitnick attack, and a defence against that sort of thing is initial sequence number needs to be very long or very difficult to predict. You've got other things such as SYN flooding and opt-ACK attacks, and you can use things like SYN cookies and nonces to help mitigate those attacks as well. There's a lot of information on that link there. I think that's 129 pages of slides just on transport layer attacks and defence, for those of you interested. So session and presentation layers, that's mainly things like NetBIOS and SIP and RPC at presentation and session layers. Again, people trying to access the data, so you've got firewalls and patching, and TLS can help mitigate those types of attacks. So TLS is very broad and goes across a number of OSI layers. And it is a good way to defend a number of different attacks. Obviously, at application layer, you've got things like XSS and SQL injection attacks, and the things that a lot of people here are probably a bit more familiar with. So in terms of offence at this layer, it's people using security scanning tools, people doing unofficial pen testing, malware and ransomware creators using vulnerabilities to attack at this layer. And some of these vulnerabilities there is a lack of design, or it's a misconfiguration, or mistakes with the design as well. Seeing it with particularly applications, there's perhaps a lack of process as part of the design and development, so lack of risk modelling. Sometimes it's down to development problems such as lack of awareness, good coding, or making a mistake. And also sometimes a lack of testing, that testing could have caught some of the vulnerabilities in applications. So in terms of defending that, I'd recommend robust design, implementation, change control processes, so all the GRC side of things that help support the interesting work that designers and developers do. And there's also some more sort of publicly accessible or public good defences, where you've got the likes of Google Project Zero doing a lot of work and finding some really interesting and in-depth problems and helping to alert and mitigate those. But I'd certainly recommend following the OWASP Top 10. So layer 8, not really an OSI layer, but it's generally referred to, which is the people layer. And some of the threats around that are misunderstandings and accidents, where there's no malicious intent, that somebody might do something like accidentally delete data, accidentally release data. We've heard of instances of people sending data unencrypted out, and that's sometimes where the ICO's leveraged fines. And it's also things like users receiving an email and not realising it contains a virus. So in terms of people capitalising on that, you've got things like social engineering. I've seen lots of interesting talks around social engineering, people gaining access to buildings where they shouldn't, and then they can start to implement more technical threats once they've bypassed the physical controls in place, but also things like bribery and blackmail. There was an interesting study where they were stood in a train station and they were offering chocolate in exchange for passwords. So it does happen. So in terms of preventative measures for people, it's things like doing background checks. A lot of employers do that and check whether they're vulnerable to bribery or blackmail, having things like physical security as a site. And then in terms of technical measures, it could be basic things like having antivirus. I know some people say they don't think antivirus is needed anymore, but I'm a strong believer in it because it can help these attacks where it's hard for people to spot things that have slipped through the net. Backups can help in the instances where there's been accidental data deletion, or things like malware or ransomware have happened and corrupted the data. And other technical measures like multi-factor authentication to ensure that it's your users that are accessing the data that they should. And education and training are a large part of that, so helping users on how they can detect problems, guidance and reporting, and having good company culture to encourage that reporting rather than blaming when mistakes have been made. So I'll move on to part 2. So diversity and skills gap, Rockstars versus Plumbers. So as mentioned earlier, I go to quite a lot of conferences. So this is my second time talking at a security conference. And sometimes people ask why I don't tend to talk, and it's because I feel I don't do cool stuff. I'm blue team through and through. I don't do exciting or interesting research. Just tend to sort of graft. And also, most enterprise ops or consultants can't talk about their day-to-day work, as it can present a risk, both security and reputational, to their employer or clients. So there are times when I go to a tech conference and feel the reaction from some might be a bit kind of, I'm a bit enterprisey, and then I can go to some enterprise security events and the response is a bit more. But to be fair, this isn't the case for everyone. There are lots of great people in Infosec, and I found it a really welcoming community of people. But I'm hoping with this talk to hopefully make it a little bit less tribal. So one of the things is that there are great techies within typical enterprise organisations, and there are also lots of researchers and sharing their knowledge and time at events like this and others. So enterprise security can be very broad. It can be everything from securing your physical environment, meeting service SLAs, managing risk, applying controls, vulnerability management, raising awareness, getting and maintaining compliance, governance, instant crisis management, detection, root cause analysis, systems, apps, patching. It's a really long list. That's from Utah State, and that's fairly old now, but that's their overview of their enterprise information security program. And you can see there are lots of different areas. And when you start to add in online services to that, it becomes even more complex. And that might be things like e-commerce and marketing to support the business, working with all these new digital companies, or directly with developers, hosting, SaaS. And then we're starting to see a trend of digital apps and Internet of Things, with brands trying to be innovative. So for enterprise work, it's not sexy work, but it's important. So how does this relate to security researchers, including pen testers and the type of people you see speaking at more technical conferences or in the media? So dependent upon security researchers, whether that's people in reversing, working for antivirus companies or MSPs, or even exposing major security vulnerabilities, which highlights the risks such as using certain service providers, like with the Cloudflare issue, or the importance of patching, like with Heartbleed, or even how difficult it can be to have secure by design with Spectre and Meltdown. Your customers are not you. They don't think like you. They don't do the things that you do. They don't have your expectations or assumptions. If they did, they wouldn't be your customers. They'd be your competitors. So people in enterprise security have different priorities. They're there to support a business, and they have different challenges to researchers. They might not have the support from the business to do the right thing, whatever that might be. That might be getting patching in, or secure by design, or hiring better coders. Security teams want to have a good network and application security. And researchers help keep enterprises safe through the products and services that they offer. And the vulnerabilities that they find and are exposed can help secure more support from the business for the work that we do. Which brings me onto compliance. So it's not only exposing vulnerabilities that can help enterprise security folk gain support from the business. Compliance programs can also help them too. I know there are lots of different opinions on security versus compliance. I think everyone is in agreement here with Talis that compliance does not equal security, but I do share the view of Redspin that there is overlap. So the compliance standards, like the ISO 27000 series and PCI DSS, require some of the basics, such as patching and user management, to carried out. And it's getting the basics right rather than shiny, blinky boxes that help most organisations stay secure. So For research, sometimes products such as antivirus and services and SOC and pen testing that they offer, they're deployed, and the only reason they're being brought into an organisation is because they're adhering to compliance standards such as PCI DSS. So my advice to enterprise security people and those in the GRC space is, if you meet someone who isn't suited and booted or look how you think they should, please don't write them off as some weird geek who doesn't understand business or enterprise or GRC. Don't be an enterprise rockstar and dismiss lowly tech work or that it's for kids. So why go to tech events outside your day-to-day work? What value does it bring? So for me, it's for things like keeping tech skills sharp. It's for things like gaining insight and understanding into emerging threats and how this relates to your environment. And it helps about your thinking about your risk models and keeping those up to date as risk models do change over time. It also gives you a sense of the work and effort that goes into security products and services. I know a lot of technical researchers and pen testers work very, very hard. And it also helps you evaluate and why you might consider one product or service over another. So depending on your organisation, why you can't run it all in-house and why there are certain things that you'll outsource. It can also help tune your snake oil sensor. The other thing I think is that learning something new can be fun and interesting. It could even pique your interest and lead to a change in focus or role. So my advice to researchers is, if you meet an enterprise security compliance person at a tech conference, please don't write them off. They may have more tech skills than you realise. And there are some, especially at the very large companies, who have some very, very technical people working for them. And the fact that somebody is there at a conference shows they're interested in learning. The other thing to remember is there's no magic money tree. So unless you're in a very privileged position to be an independent security researcher, the chances are you're in academia, possibly self-funded, or being comparatively underpaid and may look for private sector work in future. So the people you may be speaking to might be your future employer. Or you're working for a company offering security services, whether that's as a solo pen tester for hire, or you're part of a large consultancy or MSSP. And your salary is funded by enterprise security teams buying something your company offers, whether that's a product you're involved in developing or a skill or service that you're offering. And it also gives you an opportunity to meet your users and customers. But my advice to all is, whatever type of Infosecer you are, in the words of Will Wheaton, don't be a dick. Okay, any questions? So I've gone through that quite quickly. Any questions? Yeah. I'm tending to find it's happening a lot more with the BSides. So I think some BSides in the past, particularly when they've been a first edition and they've been getting, the organisers have been getting people that they know to pitch in talks, have sometimes resulted in that particular BSides being quite focused. So I am seeing a lot more diversity as things like these types of events have gone on. I think it is about expanding the network, people expanding their networks and saying, and having that understanding that people do different roles, and that it might be interesting to have, a more technical speaker at a GRC event, and vice versa. So that's probably it. I'm quite curious as to sort of how diverse this audience is in terms of split between people who are kind of students or researchers or pen testers or GRC. So if we say how many people here would consider themselves enterprise security or GRC? Okay, that's good. That's awesome. And in terms of pen testers, techie researchers, ooh, that's a shock. I suspect they're all at the other talk, which I know is about a Burp Suite extension. So, okay, any other questions? Early lunch.